Well, now 2013 is a special year for the African continent. Most countries are marking 50 years since attaining independence from European colonial rulers. With self-rule came a huge responsibility, that of nation building. One critical ingredient is the political structures that facilitate good governance. The first post-colonial African leaders stepped into a completely new territory, governing without prior experience ethnic groups that had been unwillingly banded together. The structures they found in place had been entrenched by colonialists who designed them to subjugate the local populations, open countries wide to the European settlers, facilitate their commercial interest and imperial expansionism. Since the 1960s, the continent has witnessed civilian authoritarian one-party rules, military dictatorships, and since the 1990s, some democratically elected governments. The political landscape, though, has been littered with coups, transitional administrations, and disputed elections.
This manifesto here, this manifesto, and that I will protect and uphold.
While a number of countries have held periodic elections, such as Uganda, Kenya, Nigeria, and Ghana, some argue that weak institutions lent those polls to manipulation and therefore giving an upper hand to the incumbent and ruling parties. A number of countries such as Equatorial Guinea, Zimbabwe, and Cameroon have been ruled by the same leaders for decades. While some countries have revised their colonial constitutions, very few have written new homegrown constitutions to reflect the aspirations of their people. There are those who say that 50 years is a short period for a continent that had been under the grip of colonialism to turn into a modern, smooth functioning democracy. Yet others feel Africa has had enough time to build strong democratic institutions and governance structures. Well, for more perspective, we're joined in the studio by Professor Kweku Nuamah of American University and Dr. Gnaka Lagoke, an African political analyst. Welcome to Africa 54, gentlemen.
Okay, thank you, Vincent.
Now, I want to ask a very quick question here. First, do you think Africa is where it ought to be 50 years later? First, Professor Kweku.
No, it could do better.
Yes, and Professor Lagoke.
No, but there are reasons to hope.
Yeah, there's reason to hope. Now, tell me, when you look across the continent, it's been 50 years later. What has stopped the continent of Africa from getting to where it ought to be 50 years later, Professor Nuamah?
Where should we start? There's a long list of problems. What I'll say is this. The biggest problems, the biggest wounds, the wounds that really matter are all self-inflicted. Yeah. There's a colonial legacy, which you referenced in your introduction. Then we went through periods of misrule, first under the first generation leaders. Yes. And then the military stepped in. We thought the military would do better, and they didn't. And we've come out since the third wave of democratization swept Africa. We've had these hybrid regimes that are trying to rise above some of the problems, but we have structural problems, and we have opportunities as well, as he mentioned. Yeah. And I think that the biggest problem that I see with Africa now is some states have even stopped trying. We fall back easily into the habit of blaming all of our sins on the colonial legacy.
Which is like 50 years ago. We have
exactly.
to. Now, Dr. Lagoke, you want to say something?
Yeah, when I talk about African issues, it's always from the two dimensions. Yes. There are exogenous reasons and there are endogenous reasons. I know now Professor Kweku was talking about the self-inflicted wounds. It is true, but we should not forget that the founding fathers of Africa, they had, the biggest responsibility to rule their countries in the context of a Cold War at that time. It did not matter who you were or what you wanted to do. The world was seen through the prism of what? Communism versus capitalism. And the West has supported dictators like Mobutu, Eyadema, and also the communists, Russia and China, were supporting other leaders who were advocating, the vision. So everything put together, all the things can cause, instability and many of the problems we saw in Africa.
And we know that this went on in the 60s and sometimes in the 70s, but somewhere along the way, Professor Nuamah, have you seen the determination to liberate the continent from external influence and have kind of chart a course for the continent?
It's always been there. I mean, self-determination is part of what makes Africans and other people who are oppressed elsewhere too. It's always been there. Sometimes it's been an excuse for an unelected and unrepresentative group of people to appoint themselves as leaders, in messianic tones to seize power, which they then use to oppress the very people that they claim they love. So many of our first generation leaders, they took power from the colonialists, but they were no better than the colonialists that they replaced. They just changed one dictatorial and unproductive system for another.
Is it, Dr. Lagoke, was it just maybe partially also lack of experience? I mean, they hadn't done this before.
Of course, of course, it was many of them, lack of experience. When you talk, for instance, about Zaire, now the Democratic Republic of Congo, research demonstrated that the Belgians, they did not want to train, the people they subjugated, and then when they had the opportunity to give them power, those people were not trained enough in order to rule, the country. So we have cases like that in Africa. So I know, we know our leaders did many things, we don't like. But, we have to put everything into historical context, is what I'm saying.
Yeah, context is important. But even going back to the Zaire, the Congo, without the participation of people like Chombe and Kasafubu and Mobutu, you don't have the mess that you have over there. So you can blame the Belgians all you want, but the Belgians didn't put these people there.
I mean, there was a time frame by which one needed to show that, okay, enough is enough of external influence. Some have said actually that African leaders have behaved like mercenaries, like they don't actually belong to the continent and they're there to just rip apart the continent for their own benefits.
Vincent, this is part of human nature. This is part of human nature. Whoever has power has the tendency to exaggerate or to abuse or to oppress other people. If the structures are not put in place in order to refrain him from using that power. So we saw that everywhere. Quickly, not to talk about Africa as a tragedy. 1974, Portugal experienced like a coup d'etat not long ago. We can go back to Yugoslavia. We can talk about the 2 world wars in Europe. And even in America here, from 1776, we have to wait until what, the 60s to see black people to get the right to vote. So, it is a long process. Right? 50 years seem to be too much, but in the history of a continent, that's nothing.
But you cannot reinvent the wheel, though, because we learn from other people's mistakes.
So
all this,
of course,
don't have to go back and say we also need 200 years to evolve.
Of course, I agree. So quickly, that's why we saw that there are some revolutions. The revolution that put an end to colonial rule, the revolution that put an end to apartheid in South Africa, and the revolution today that brought democracy and those national conferences and the rise, we saw from 1989 from Europe.
You know what? Thank you. We will continue this conversation.
So there are positive things coming to Africa. Thank you.
Definitely.
Okay.
Thank you very much, gentlemen. Professor Nuamah and Dr. Lagoke. Now, we want to know what you think about Africa 54 and the stories we cover. Join the conversation on Facebook. The address is VOA Africa 54, and check out our headlines 24/7 on voaafrica.com.